obviously, after having a stellar freshman season, took a step back as a sophomore, even though he closed well, and then just dedicated himself to being a top back and certainly just had an all-time great season, arguably the best in Buckeye history during the regular season in 2019. So he moves on to the NFL. Ohio State has as good a running back tradition as anybody in the nation. And they've certainly had to replace guys like JK Dobbins in the past. So, Griffin, we're going to rely on you to kind of take us through the greats that have had to be replaced and how that's looked for Ohio State in the past.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people are wondering what or how big is the drop-off going to be following JK Dobbins, who obviously had an all-time great career, especially obviously this past year, the most single-season yards in program history at that running back position. And people are wondering, I mean, the addition of Trey Sermon for Ohio State is obviously huge, but I mean, he hasn't had 1,000-yard year yet, even for Oklahoma. But before Trey Sermon, it was like, okay, you're looking at Master Teague, a guy who didn't run the ball particularly well in the biggest spots last year. You look at his games against Clemson, Michigan, his yards per carry very low in those games. Obviously, he didn't get a ton of sample size there. But so people are looking at like, man, Ohio State, they're a running back recruit from the 2020 class, only a 3-star guy. So you're looking at that and you're kind of like, okay, the next big superstar, like at running back, he might not be on that roster right there, especially with guys like Marcus Crowley coming off of a season-ending injury for him. And then after the first spring practice, Master T goes down with an ankle injury. And so they rule him out for all the spring. We don't know, obviously the extent of that injury because they don't disclose a lot about injuries with the program now. I will say he didn't have like a brace or wasn't on crutches or anything like that when the team reopened voluntary workouts. So that was one thing we noted. But so I figured that people would be wondering, what will Ohio State's running game look like from that position? And then so I kind of went back in that story I did and looked at, after Archie Griffin, after Eddie George, after all the top 5 rushing leaders in school history, what did the run game look like the next year? And so what I found was anytime that they had to replace a guy in their top 5, they produced a 1,000-yard rusher the very next season. And I mean, that kind of goes back to, just how good Ohio State has been, in the run game and the legendary running backs over the years. But I think even after the big Eddie George year, 95, I think it was, when he ran for like 1,900 yards, that was the most in school history up until Dobbins broke that record. I mean, even the next year, they had Pepe Pearson. He ran for 1,200 yards that next year. Yep. So it's like, even after these all-time great years, I think Keith Byers came after maybe Tim Spencer. And Tim Spencer, I feel like that's a name that doesn't, get thought of or talked about at least.
82 would have been his last year.
Yeah. And I feel like he doesn't get, I don't know, the recognition maybe in terms of big Ohio State running back names. But I think right after him was Keith Byers. And I'm not even looking at my article here or anything like that. But and then obviously like he comes and has, just monster seasons, tons of touchdowns. And so they've just been really good at re-upping that position. And I know coming down the pipeline now, Ohio State's got guys like Evan Pryor and Travion Henderson, guys coming up in these next couple recruiting classes that are looking like, the next big time stars of running back. And basically, I just think this season, I'm not expecting a Trey Sermon to go crazy and run for 1,500 yards or even 13. I would say Trey Sermon, I would call it, if the season was played in its entirety this year, he'd get like 1,200 yards, maybe 1,100 yards, and then Master T runs for another, 800 something yards. That's what I kind of see for Ohio State this season at the running back position.
Yeah, Keith Byers had 2 monster seasons, 83 and 84. The 84 campaign for him, he almost won the Heisman, finished second, scored 24 touchdowns, ran for 1,700 yards. And he was supposed to have a huge 85 season, but he got hurt. So he only ran for 200 yards that year. And I'm trying to think who would have run for 1,000 yards. I'm thinking John Woolridge or somebody on that 85 team. So they had nobody at 1,000 yards. Woolridge at 820. on that 85 team under Earl Bruce. All right, good stuff. Griffin Strom on the line from Buckeye Grove talking Ohio State football. So I work in the TV industry, Griffin, and see the TV ratings that come back are pretty consistent, that the markets in the Deep South are crazy about college football. We know. But Columbus ranks right there, if not near the top of that stack, with those markets, smaller markets in Alabama, lower Tennessee, and some other markets I could rip off. But what have you uncovered in looking at Ohio State TV ratings? And then I'm sure I'll have something to say, because this is a curious conversation. I like this. So you looked at some things going back to 2012.
Yeah, so there's so I was just, and this even kind of spans back further than just me looking at the Ohio State football numbers. I was just kind of getting curious about sporting events and TV ratings in general. I guess it was kind of spurred on by, I was watching The Last Dance, Michael Jordan documentary and whatnot, and seeing that one series, the 97 or 98 series with the Jazz, like that game 6 for Michael Jordan was like the most watched basketball game of all time, and it still is, I believe. And so I was just kind of curious, looking at baseball World Series ratings numbers, NFL Super Bowl ratings numbers, just to see okay, how popular comparatively are these huge sporting events. And so then I started looking at college football ratings. So I started digging into the week by week ratings of the past however many years, dating back to 2012. And so what I found is, so I'm not trying to say that Ohio State has more game-to-game average viewers or anything like that than an Alabama or something like that, because those, as you mentioned, like the markets for those Southern teams and the SEC powers, from a week-to-week basis, they definitely have the average viewers. They definitely have Ohio State in that regard. But so what I found was, if you take the national championship game out of the equation, and I'm taking out of the equation because it doesn't have to compete with other college football games. So I'm looking at Saturdays throughout the season, right? Or even some of the bowl games when they have to compete with other bowl games for ratings. Which team had the most number one weeks? So which team had the most weeks where their game was the most watched? And so for the past 2 years, again, if you take the national championship out, Ohio State had the most weeks where they had the most highly rated game, which I just thought was very interesting, because people, especially with people saying, oh, like ESPN is on how they talk about it, the SEC and this and that. But I just thought it was interesting to find that Ohio State had like 5 or 6 of the highest viewed games. And then, so what I found also was that looking back earlier in the decade, like they might have had one game during the regular season, in even the national championship year, maybe, that they were the most highly rated game that week. But then this past year they had like 5 or 6 or something like that. And obviously there's been different things with Ohio State going, the rights to Ohio State and Big Ten games, going over to Fox and things like that, and what Fox has been doing now with their big noon kickoff stuff, and how they've been really pushing Ohio State in those primetime spots for them, and how they've built their kind of coverage around college football, and kind of revamped it. What they've done the last couple of years. But yeah, I just thought that stuff was interesting to me to kind of break that down and put it in that story.
If you look at the top 10 rated games in the regular season in college football over the last several seasons, you'll see nothing but SEC and Big Ten games.
Right.
There might be one exception, maybe. But from my recollection, all 10 are SEC and Big Ten games. Well, if you're talking about the Big Ten, you're basically talking an Ohio State game. The one exception off the top of my head, and I can't imagine a scenario where it would be anybody else, would be Penn State against Michigan. It would be the only exception. Otherwise, it's Ohio State, Penn State. It's Ohio State, Michigan. It's a Big Ten championship game involving Ohio State. So, it's obviously, those are the two power brokers in the sport when it comes to eyes on the TV, eyes digitally, online. rear ends in the seats at the games. And again, the money that comes into the sport is primarily dictated by television and television ratings, and that's owned by the SEC and the Big Ten over the other three leagues by far. Interesting stuff. Griffin Strom joined his work there on Buckeye Grove. Anything else to share with us?
I'm just, working on stuff all the time, trying to you find interesting angles for stories. Keep it looking for story ideas, man. I've been paying attention to the all decade stuff, obviously, this week. It was kind of funny on our message board over at Buckeye Grove. People were kind of groaning about speculating that Kirk Ferentz might win the Big Ten's all decade coach of the decade, just because he's won the Coach of the Year award, and Urban Meyer never won the Coach of the Year award. So people were kind of groaning about that. But then obviously they announced that Urban Meyer was the coach of the decade, JT Barrett was the quarterback of the decade, and they even had Braxton Miller on there for their all-purpose player. So that stuff's been kind of fun. I think we're going to do kind of our own all-decade picks coming up maybe next week at Buckeye Grove too. So that's been fun to look at as well.
Yeah, is there really any debate there? One coach wins 90+% of his games, and the other guy's like 65%. And even the years Ohio State has not won the Big Ten, people generally have felt as though they were still the best team in the Big Ten. They just slipped up in 2015 and 16. Urban Meyer, he's got the only undefeated team in the decade. He's got the only national championship in the decade. And again, the consistent winning percentages just blows everyone away. Right. I understand the coach of the year, when you vote on that, you're pretty much matching up, okay, who had a team that was not expected to achieve much and who coached them up. And I understand that mindset in looking at a coach of the year, but when you're looking at coach of the decade, hey, just give it to the guy that won, especially when it's not even close. So
right.
Good call there. Griffin Strom, Buckeye Grove. We appreciate you stopping by, Griffin.
Hey, Mark, thanks so much for having me on today. Have a great 4th of July to everyone watching as well. And yeah, I'd love to come back on whenever I could, going forward. And thanks so much for having me.